Well, welcome to Richie's Roost. It is a beautiful day out here, sunshine and blue sky. It's kind of cool this morning, Mississippi weather being what it is in late April. It was about 50 degrees. That's pretty chilly here, but it must be according to this climate change. Well, I swore I wasn't going to get into that today, so I'm not. Look, I just thought we'd have a little levity today. We've had some bad news and people fussing and carrying on and hollering, and I just thought it was time to take a little break, so that's what we're going to do. Just some random thoughts in no particular order that I've thought of when musing about today's events and conditions. I thought I'd poke a little fun. I hope it's okay with you. Of course, talk is cheap. You've heard that. Talk is cheap. Except, of course, when Congress does it. How much is $1 trillion anyway? Some folks never exaggerate. They just remember big. You've seen a few of them on TV. And the mystery of government is not how it works, but how to make it stop. Now, there was a guy named Robert Sarnoff. He was a CEO of RCA back in the 60s, 70s. Smart guy, smart man. But I remember one thing he said. He said that finance, which Congress and legislators and all these politicians all get into finance. You wonder who knows what about anything having to do with finance. Sarnoff said finance is the art of passing currency from hand to hand until it finally disappears. That's as good as anything I've heard, I guess. And I'm saying that if all the financial experts in this country were laid end to end, they'd still point in all directions. Figure that out. And meteorologists, by the way, I guess this is one of the interesting things that have come from climate change, meteorologists' findings. They finally figured out why Buffalo, New York is so hard hit during the winter with such deep snows. It's because the city is at the precise point when all the cold air from Canada comes down and meets all the hot air coming up from Washington. Makes more sense than anything I've heard to date. And the politicians do the polka. Have you ever heard of politicians polka? Takes them a long time to learn, but they get really good at it. See, what it is, you take one step forward, 2 steps back, and sidestep the issues. There's a fellow named Doug Larson who wisely said that knowledge, if you look at some of the speeches on television these days, he says that knowledge has never been known to enter the head by way of an open mouth. Think about that. I hear a big truck. Can you see it on? Yeah, I see the top of it coming by. Got my back to the road. It makes a lot of racket. Otherwise, it's been pretty quiet this afternoon. But folks heading to work, heading home, I guess. Now listen, this was overheard in a government cafeteria, supposedly. Sounds about right. Overheard in a government cafeteria. Guy said, I'd clarify my position, but it would only confuse things. Now these days, if you don't have anything nice to say about somebody famous, the chances are you can get a major book deal. Seems like everybody on television now that is a reporter of sorts or some kind of commentator has a book out, lots of them. And some of them pretty good ones, I understand. I hadn't read a lot of them, but they say some of them pretty good, but everybody's got one, seems like. And you ever notice that there was a time when you could fetch a beer or a snack from the refrigerator during a TV commercial? Well, now you can go out and rake the yard while there are commercials going on. Also, have you ever noticed that the people who are wrong always seem to talk louder than anybody else? Some even use bull horns. Now, speaking about loud talking, I remember a dinner party I attended one time. The hostess was noticeably nervous because two of the guests were lawyers, and one of the guests was an insurance executive who was monopolizing the conversation with long, loud, detailed accounts of some litigation he had recently been involved in. And in the end, he concluded, "You know who got all the money?" And the hostess just cringed, knowing what was coming next. He said, "The lawyers." Well, that looked pretty bad until the wife of one of the lawyers quipped and said, "Well, I just love a story with a happy ending." All lawyers need wives like that. I thought that was great. And speaking of litigation, I guess all the lawsuits concerning the accuracy or lack thereof of the ballot counting machines used during the 2020 election have been settled. Their certified results reminded me of the story about a company's new employee who was standing in front of a big paper shredder looking awful confused. And a secretary came by and noticed he looked confused, and she asked him if she could help. He said, "Yeah, how does this thing work?" She said, "Well, that's simple," and took the fat document of paper, fat bundle of documents that he had from him, and fed it through the machine. And he saw that it disappeared, and he said, "Well, thank you very much. But where did the copies come out?" Well, enough said about that. Now, been a lot of talk about the age of some of our officials: Biden, Trump, Feinstein. For example, and the potential for problems caused by this condition. Well, forgetfulness might be one of them, but I seem to have had that problem all my life. I remember on one occasion when I was on a business trip to San Francisco, I completely forgot my bride's birthday and didn't call her. Well, in a panic the next day, when I suddenly remembered my dumb mistake, I hurried to the jewelry counter in a big department store in San Francisco, and I explained my dilemma to the nice lady behind the counter at the jewelry department. And she informed me. She said, "Sir, I'm sorry, but we don't have anything that expensive." She was right. And I've reached the age when that malady exhibits itself pretty often, but I take solace in observing the attitude and witticism showed by George Burns. You remember George? He lived to be 100 years old and was sharp to the very end, 100 years and 3 months. And in an interview at about, I guess, age 96 or so, the reporter asked him, she said, "Is it true that you still go out with young women?" George said, "Yep." She said, "Well, is it true that you still smoke 10 or 15 cigars every day?" George said, "Yes." She said, is it true that you still take a few drinks every day? George said, yes, ma'am. She said, well, what does your doctor say? George said, nothing. He's dead. Oh, well, he was in another interview when the reporter asked her if she could ask him a very personal question. George said, sure. And she asked him, Mr. Burns, when did you lose interest in sex? And George looked up and hesitated for a minute and said, about 2:30 this morning. Now, I don't know whether that's true, but I hope it is. And Perry alludes to the fact that sometimes I mistake my imagination for my memory. And she's right, of course. Well, there's a little oral surgery scheduled for me later this week. So next week might be somewhat garbled in its presentation. And if the medication hasn't worn off by the time I make that little presentation, the presentation might resemble that of the average politician. I hope I can do better than that. All right, that's enough for today. I've enjoyed talking with you, and I hope you'll check back in with us next week. So, till that time, I'm Jim Ritchie. I'll see you again next time.